They're not here for the rent. Baby, they're here for you. Naomi Carter stopped with her spoon halfway to her mouth. The dry cereal in the chipped plastic bowl suddenly tasted like dust. Outside the apartment window, the first black SUV had already pulled up to the curb, long and glossy, its paint catching the weak winter light like polished stone. Then a second one rolled in behind it. Then a third. Naomi stood frozen on the faded linoleum floor in her sock feet, her breath fogging the cold glass as she counted under her breath, one after another, until the narrow street in front of their building looked less like the south side of Chicago and more like the entrance to some place people like her only saw on TV. 12 cars. Maybe more. All dark windows. All perfect. All silent. Behind her, the radiator hissed and knocked like it was struggling to stay alive. The whole apartment smelled faintly of instant oatmeal, old heat, and the menthol rub her mother had used on her chest all night. Naomi tightened her fingers around the bowl. She was only 9 years old, small for her age, with 2 neat braids and an oversized sweatshirt that had once belonged to a cousin. And in that moment, with dawn barely lifting over the icy rooftops, one awful thought hit her before any good one could. Maybe they came because she touched the car. Maybe rich people notice things like that. Maybe rich people sent men in long coats when a little black girl climbed onto the side of their expensive SUV in the middle of a blizzard. Her mother, Tasha Carter, stood near the kitchenette wrapped in a robe and wool socks, one hand pressed to the counter for balance, still pale from the flu that had kept her in bed for 2 days. She looked out once, then looked back at Naomi with an expression Naomi couldn't read all the way. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something softer, something stunned. "Mama," Naomi whispered, not taking her eyes off the line of cars. "Did I do something wrong?" Tasha crossed the small room, slow but steady, and rested a warm hand on the back of Naomi's head. "No, baby," she said quietly. "I think maybe you did something right." But Naomi's stomach stayed tight, because 3 nights earlier, nothing had felt right. 3 nights earlier, the whole city had been swallowed by snow. Not the pretty kind that drifted down soft and gentle, the kind kids made angels in. This had been the hard kind, the mean kind. Wind whipping around corners so fast it felt like the air had teeth. Naomi had been coming back from Wallace Pharmacy with a paper bag clutched to her chest. Inside it a bottle of cough syrup, a sleeve of crackers, and the last of the change her mother had saved in a jelly jar above the sink. The snow was already up past her ankles, and every step in her worn boots made a wet, squeaking sound. Streetlights glowed dim and hazy behind curtains of white. The world had gone quiet in that strange way it does during the worst kind of storm, like the whole city was holding its breath. That was when she saw the headlights. One beam pointed wrong, half buried in a snowbank at the end of Mercer Street. At first she thought the SUV had been abandoned. It was too clean, too expensive looking, too out of place on that block. But then she saw movement behind the windshield. A man in the driver's seat, slumped sideways. Still, Naomi had stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, snow hitting her cheeks, her paper bag crinkling in her arms. Most grown folks would have kept walking. Plenty did. A bus hissed past at the corner. 2 men in heavy coats glanced once and kept going. Somewhere a door slammed. Nobody wanted to stop in that cold. Nobody wanted trouble. But Naomi stood there staring at that crooked beam of light cutting into the storm, and something in her chest pulled tight. She didn't know his name. She didn't know he was a billionaire. All she knew was that somebody inside that car looked alone, and the snow was getting deeper. Naomi looked left, then right, as if an adult might suddenly appear and tell her what to do, but Mercer Street stayed empty except for the storm. Snow spun through the yellow cone of the bent streetlight, and the wind pushed hard against her little frame, shoving at her coat and stinging her eyes until tears mixed with melted flakes on her lashes. She shifted the paper pharmacy bag under one arm and stepped off the curb. The snow on the street was deeper than it had looked from the sidewalk, swallowing her boots almost to the tops. By the time she reached the SUV, her socks were already damp. Up close, the vehicle seemed enormous, all dark metal and sleek lines glazed with ice, its front wheel half buried in a drift that had hardened around the tire like concrete. Naomi pressed one mittenless hand to the passenger door and flinched at the cold. Through the glass, she could see him more clearly now, a man maybe in his 60s, silver at the temples, expensive wool coat, one hand slack in his lap, the other resting near the steering wheel, as if he had meant to move, and then forgotten how. His eyes were closed. His face had gone that strange pale color people got when they had been in the cold too long. Naomi knocked once. Nothing. She knocked harder. Still nothing. Her heart began to beat so fast it made her ears ring. "Mister," she called through the window, her voice small against the wind. "Mister, can you hear me?" This time his eyelids fluttered, barely. That was enough. Naomi hurried around to the driver's side, almost slipping where the snow had packed down to slick ice. The door was not locked, but it opened only an inch before a mound of drifted snow blocked it. She pulled with both hands, gritting her teeth, until the gap widened just enough for the wind to rush inside. At once the man stirred and sucked in a shaky breath. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused at first, then landed on her face as if he could not understand why a child was standing outside his car in the middle of a blizzard. "Sir, stay awake," Naomi said quickly. She had no idea whether that was the right thing to say. It was just what people said in movies when something bad was happening. "You cannot go to sleep yet." The man tried to speak, but his lips barely moved. She leaned closer and caught only a whisper of sound, too weak to make out. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and cold air. Naomi set the pharmacy bag carefully on the floorboard by her boots and looked around for anything useful. The heater was dead. The dashboard glowed dim and confused. His phone sat in the cup holder, black screen, no charge. She swallowed hard. "Okay," she whispered, mostly to herself now. "Okay, I am here." She peeled off her own scarf, red wool with loose threads at the edges and her initials stitched badly in one corner by her mother last winter, and reached through the narrow opening to wrap it around his neck. Her fingers fumbled from the cold. The man winced a little when the icy air hit his skin, but then he sank into the warmth of the scarf, as if his body recognized help before his mind did. Naomi glanced back toward the sidewalk. A pair of headlights moved at the far end of the block, then turned away. She opened her mouth to yell, but the wind snatched her voice and threw it somewhere else. No one stopped. No one even slowed down. For one frightening second, she felt how small she really was. 9 years old, not even 70 pounds, standing beside a stranded luxury SUV on a street that always seemed to teach people to mind their own business. But then the man inside the car made a soft sound. Not words, more like the rough edge of a cough. And Naomi forgot to be scared for herself. "Do not worry," she said, trying to make her voice sound older than it was. "I am going to get help. You just have to stay with me, okay?" His eyes drifted toward her again. There was confusion in them, and exhaustion, but something else too. Trust, maybe. Or maybe he was simply too weak to argue. Naomi looked down at the paper bag on the floorboard. The cough syrup for her mother. The crackers. The little white receipt folded at the bottom. She thought of Tasha back at the apartment, wrapped in blankets, waiting for her to come home. Then she looked back at the man with the trembling hands and the snow gathering on his coat sleeve where the door stood cracked open. She made her choice in the space of one breath. She grabbed the bag, tucked it deeper inside the car by his feet to keep it dry, and pulled the door as closed as the drift would allow. "I will come back," she told him. "I promise." Then Naomi turned and started running through the storm, her legs burning, her braids whipping against her hood, the snow climbing to her shins. With every step toward the gas station, nearly half a mile away. By the time Naomi reached the gas station on Halstead, her lungs felt scraped raw by the cold. The paper sign taped inside the front window read closed, but the lights were still on over the register, casting a tired yellow glow across the empty chip aisle and the humming soda cooler in the back. Naomi stumbled to the door and yanked on the handle with both hands. Locked. She hit the glass with her palm once, then again, harder this time. "Please," she shouted, though the wind stole half the word. "Please open up." For a second nothing happened. Then a shape moved behind the counter. An older man in a navy quilted jacket appeared, frowning, one hand holding a mop, the other lifting the blinds just enough to see her face. His mouth tightened when he saw a little black girl alone in the storm. He cracked the door 2 inches. "Store is closed," he said over the wind. "Go on home now." Naomi grabbed the edge of the door before he could shut it. "There is a man in a car on Mercer," she said breathlessly. "He is sick or hurt or freezing. I do not know, but he cannot move and he is by himself." The man's eyes flicked past her toward the street. Snow blew sideways under the station canopy. You talking about that fancy truck down by the old laundromat? He asked. Naomi nodded so fast her braids tapped her cheeks. Please call 911. He studied her, and something skeptical settled into his face. Not cruel exactly, just tired, guarded, the kind of look adults wore when life had taught them that trouble often arrived in small, urgent packages. Honey, folks in those cars got phones. They got roadside service. They got people, he said. You need to get yourself out of this weather. Naomi could not believe what she was hearing. Her eyelashes were wet with melting snow, her hands numb, her chest heaving, and this man was still talking like the storm had room for patience. His phone is dead, she said. I saw it. He is cold. He looked at me, and he could barely open his eyes. The man shifted his mop to the wall and sighed. Could be drunk. Could be sleeping it off. Could be any number of things. Naomi stared at him through the crack in the door, feeling something hot and sharp rise in her throat that had nothing to do with warmth. She thought of the pale face behind the steering wheel, the trembling hand, the red scarf around his neck. Or he could die if nobody helps him, she said, her voice suddenly very steady. That landed. The man blinked. The storm hissed around them. Somewhere overhead, the neon gas sign buzzed like an insect trapped in winter. Then another voice called from inside. Earl, what is going on? A woman in a puffy silver coat stepped out from the back office, keys in hand, her dark curls tucked into a knit cap. She took one look at Naomi standing there with snow caked on her boots and opened the door wider without asking permission from anybody. Warm air spilled over Naomi's face so fast it almost hurt. Get in here, baby, the woman said. You are freezing. Naomi stepped inside, shivering so hard now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to hide. The station smelled like burned coffee, floor cleaner, and the hot rollers turning slowly under the heat lamp. The woman crouched to Naomi's level. Tell me exactly what happened. Naomi did, all in one rush. The car, the man, the dead phone, the way nobody stopped, the scarf, her mother waiting at home. By the end of it, the woman had already reached for the landline. This is Denise from Halstead Fuel, she said into the receiver. I need emergency response on Mercer, near the old laundromat. There is a stranded driver in this storm, possibly hypothermic. Earl rubbed a hand over his jaw, ashamed now, though he did not say it out loud. He grabbed his keys off the counter. I got blankets in the truck, he muttered. Denise nodded once. Good. We are going. Naomi looked up at them, startled. Can I come too? No, ma'am, Denise said firmly but kindly. You are staying right here where it is warm. Naomi opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Denise was already wrapping a scratchy wool blanket around her shoulders and pushing a styrofoam cup of hot chocolate into her hands. Her fingers shook so badly some of it spilled over the rim. Through the front window, she watched Earl's pickup pull out into the white blur, Denise right behind him in her small sedan. The taillights glowed red, then disappeared. Suddenly the station felt too quiet. The heater rattled in the ceiling vent. Somewhere a refrigerator compressor clicked on. Naomi climbed onto a plastic chair beside the window, still in her wet boots, blanket tucked tight around her, and stared into the storm like she could force it to give the man back alive. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Then at last, far down the street, she saw them. Flashing lights, faint at first, blue and amber reflecting off the blowing snow, growing brighter as they moved toward Mercer. Naomi let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. But relief only lasted a second, because just as the first rescue vehicle turned the corner, one thought crashed into her chest harder than the wind ever had. Her mother was still home alone, sick, with no medicine, and Naomi had left the pharmacy bag on the floor of a stranger's car. Naomi set the cup down so fast a brown ring spread across the counter. My medicine, she whispered, then louder. My mom's medicine is still in his car. Earl had just come back through the station door, shoulders dusted with snow, his face red from the wind. Denise was right behind him, breathing hard, one glove half off as she reached for the counter to steady herself. Both of them looked at Naomi at the same time. They got the man out, Earl said first, like he wanted to lead with the good news. Ambulance took him less than a minute ago. He was in rough shape, but he was breathing. Your little scarf is probably the only reason he stayed warm long enough. Naomi barely heard the last part. Her mind was already racing ahead to the apartment, to Tasha under two blankets on the pull-out couch, her voice hoarse, her forehead hot. her cough dry and deep the way it sounded when she tried to hide it. Naomi had used the last of the cash in the jelly jar on that bottle of syrup. There was no extra money, no second trip, no backup plan. Denise followed Naomi's eyes and understood before another word had to be said. "The bag was still inside?" she asked gently. Naomi nodded, blinking too fast now. "On the floor by his shoes. I tucked it there so it would not get wet." Earl exhaled through his nose and rubbed a hand over his chin. "Tow truck is hooking the SUV now," he said. "Might still be there." Naomi was already pushing the blanket off her shoulders. Denise put a hand out. "No, ma'am. You are not going back out in this storm." "But my mom needs it," Naomi said, and there was no whining in her voice, no tantrum, just plain truth, which somehow made it hit harder. The station lights hummed overhead. Outside, the storm still lashed at the windows, though the gusts had softened a little. Denise looked at Earl. Earl looked at the clock, then at the keys in his hand, then at Naomi standing there with wet boots and a brave little face that had already done more tonight than most adults. "I will go," he said finally. "You stay put this time." Naomi opened her mouth to argue, but Denise crouched beside her and zipped up her coat properly, all the way to her chin. "Let somebody help you now," she said. It was said so softly that Naomi had no defense against it. Earl was back out the door before the sentence finished. Naomi climbed down from the plastic chair and paced 3 squares of tile between the coffee station and the lottery display, then back again. The heater kept blowing dry air that smelled faintly metallic. Denise made another pot of coffee she did not need, just to have something to do with her hands. Every so often she glanced at Naomi, then away, as if giving the child privacy for the size of the worry sitting in her small chest. Finally the bell over the door gave a tired jingle, and Earl came in holding the pharmacy bag high like proof of life. Naomi's whole body loosened so suddenly her knees almost gave. She ran to him, then stopped short, remembering her manners. Earl noticed. He handed her the bag with surprising care. "Everything's still in there," he said. "A little damp at the bottom, but the bottle is fine." Naomi clutched it to her chest. "Thank you." Earl gave a short nod, embarrassed by the way gratitude from a child had a way of exposing what kind of grown-up you had been 5 minutes earlier. "Tow guy said the driver's people will handle the vehicle," he added. "Fancy folks always got people." Denise slid a fresh receipt pad aside and reached for her purse. "I am taking you home," she said. "And before you say no, understand this is not a debate." The ride to Naomi's apartment building was only 6 blocks, but in the storm it felt longer. Denise's sedan smelled like vanilla air freshener, and old leather seats cracked at the edges. Naomi sat in front with the pharmacy bag in her lap and watched the city pass in blurred white and amber. Snow clung to chain-link fences, church steps, bus benches, the shoulders of people hurrying with heads down. At every red light the world looked softer than it did in daylight, as if the storm had covered the city's sharpest parts for a few hours. When they pulled up outside Naomi's building, the brick looked almost silver under the street lamp. Several windows were dark. One flickered blue from a television somewhere on the 2nd floor. Denise parked, but did not turn off the engine right away. She looked at Naomi with a seriousness that felt almost ceremonial. "You did a very brave thing tonight," she said. Naomi stared down at the paper bag. "I just did not want him to be alone." Denise's expression changed then, just a little, the way faces do when they have been quietly moved. "That," she said, "is exactly what brave usually looks like." Naomi carried those words upstairs with the medicine pressed against her coat. The hallway smelled like bleach, fried onions from somebody's late dinner, and damp wool drying on radiators. When she opened the apartment door, warm air and menthol rolled over her. Tasha was already awake, sitting up on the couch beneath the plaid blanket, worry plain on her tired face. "Naomi Elise Carter," she said, hand to her chest, half relief and half scolding. "Do you know what time it is?" Naomi shut the door behind her, snow melting off her boots onto the mat, and for the first time all night, she did not know where to begin. The answer came in pieces, like snow sliding off a roof, one soft thud at a time. Naomi set the pharmacy bag on the tiny kitchen table, unzipped her coat with stiff fingers, and tried to explain everything without making it sound bigger than it had felt while it was happening. But once she started, the whole night came spilling out. The stranded SUV, the pale man in the driver's seat, the red scarf, the run to the gas station, Denise. Earl. The ambulance lights. Her forgotten medicine. Tasha listened without interrupting, one hand curled around the edge of her blanket, the other resting over her mouth as if she could hold back shock by covering it. The apartment was quiet except for the radiator tapping in the corner and the distant rumble of the elevated train a few blocks away. When Naomi finally finished, the room seemed to lean into the silence. Then Tasha opened her arms. Naomi crossed the worn carpet and climbed into them, pressing her cold cheek against her mother's robe. Tasha smelled like vapor rub, laundry soap, and the same tired tenderness Naomi had known her whole life. "Baby," Tasha whispered into her braids. "You scared me half to death." Naomi drew back, just enough to search her mother's face. "I know. I am sorry." Tasha touched Naomi's chin gently. "Do not be sorry for helping somebody. Just do not ever disappear into a blizzard again without telling me first." Naomi gave a tiny, guilty nod. It was such a child's response to such an enormous night that Tasha almost laughed, except the laugh caught in her throat and turned into a cough instead. Naomi sprang into motion at once, unscrewing the bottle cap, pouring the syrup with both hands so she would not spill a drop, waiting while her mother swallowed it slowly with a grimace. There was comfort in the little routine, in the measured spoonful, in the way care could be poured, handed over, and received. After that, Naomi heated canned soup on the stove the way Tasha had taught her, stirring with a wooden spoon while the window over the sink rattled in the wind. Outside, the storm still moved through the city in long white sheets, but inside the apartment the kitchen light cast a buttery circle over chipped countertops and a stack of clean dishes turned upside down to dry. Their world was small. 2 rooms, thin walls, second-hand furniture, a refrigerator that hummed louder than it should. But in that hour before midnight, with soup steaming and medicine finally doing its work, it felt held together by something stronger than money. Naomi carried a bowl to the couch and sat close enough that her shoulder touched Tasha's arm. "Do you think he is okay?" she asked after a while. Tasha looked at the soup for a long second before answering. "I think somebody who gets found by you in a snowstorm has a pretty good chance." Naomi did not smile. She kept picturing his face in the dim glow of the dashboard, the way his eyes had struggled to stay open, the way his hand had trembled even after she wrapped the scarf around his neck. "I did not even ask his name," she said. Tasha leaned back against the cushion, blanket tucked under her elbows. Sometimes helping first and learning names later is not the worst order. Naomi let that settle. Then her gaze drifted to the window where the dark glass reflected the little apartment back at them. For the first time, she noticed how strange the night must have sounded from the outside. A little black girl walking alone in a storm. A rich man in a stranded SUV. A gas station clerk finally believing her. Rescue lights against dirty snowbanks. The city had a way of putting people in the same story who never would have met in daylight. Tasha must have seen the thoughtfulness in her face, because she reached over and smoothed the sleeve of Naomi's sweatshirt. "Did anybody ask your name?" she asked. Naomi shook her head. "Denise did. Earl too. But not the people from the ambulance. They just took him." Tasha's expression tightened in that quiet adult way that children notice even when they cannot name it. "Well," she said softly, "that is a shame." Naomi did not answer. She was too tired now, tired in her bones, the kind that made her limbs feel heavy and her voice disappear. Tasha touched the red mark the scarf had left against Naomi's neck where the wool had rubbed during her run. "You gave him your scarf?" Naomi nodded. "He looked colder than me." Tasha closed her eyes for one brief second, not from disapproval, but from the pure ache of loving a child whose heart reached outward before it protected itself. "Come on," she said finally. "Bed." Naomi changed into pajamas warmed by a few minutes on the radiator and brushed her teeth at the tiny sink while the bathroom mirror fogged around the edges. Then she climbed under the comforter on the fold-out beside the couch because she did not want to be in the bedroom alone while the storm still pressed at the windows. Tasha switched off the kitchen light, leaving only the lamp near the television glowing soft gold across the room. Shadows settled gently over the apartment. Naomi curled on her side, listening to the building breathe around her. Pipes ticking. Someone upstairs dragging a chair. Wind fussing at the corners of the window frame. She should have fallen asleep fast after a night like that. Instead, she stared at the dim outline of the ceiling and thought about the scarf. Thought about the man waking up without it. Thought about whether he would remember a child's voice telling him to stay awake. At some point, Tasha, already drowsy from medicine, murmured into the dark, "What matters is you did not leave him there." Naomi blinked at the ceiling. "I know." A pause. Then, very small, almost lost under the hiss of the radiator, she added, "I just hope he did not feel alone." And somewhere across the city, in a private hospital room bright with machines and winter light, the man she could not stop thinking about opened his eyes, lifted a weak hand to the red wool at his throat, and knew at once that someone he had never met had chosen not to leave him behind. When Richard Holloway woke fully the next morning, the first thing he noticed was not the private hospital room, not the pale winter light spilling through the motorized shades, and not the low murmur of machines tracking every beat his body still owed him. It was the scarf, red wool, slightly crooked stitches, child-sized, resting against the white blanket pulled over his chest like a fact no one in the room could explain away. He touched it with careful fingers, still weak, and the fibers scratched softly against his skin. A memory returned in pieces. A small face at the window, snow rushing sideways. A voice telling him, with an authority too calm for someone so young, that he could not go to sleep yet. He turned his head toward the chair beside the bed just as Ethan Brooks stood from it, jacket still on, tie loosened, phone in one hand, and relief all over his tired face. Ethan had been Richard's driver for 11 years, the kind of man who never raised his voice, never missed a turn, and always seemed to appear 1 second before he was needed. Now his eyes flicked to the scarf, and then back to Richard's face. "You remember something," Ethan said quietly. Richard's throat was dry enough to sting. "A girl," he said. Even speaking felt expensive. "Little girl. Outside the car." Ethan let out a breath and sat back down slowly, as if he had been waiting all night for exactly those words. "We think so too." Richard frowned. "Think." Ethan reached for the tablet on the side table and tapped the screen awake. "The emergency responders found you alone when they arrived. No child on scene by then. But the tow operator mentioned a gas station call came in from a young girl saying a stranded man could not move. We pulled the vehicle camera this morning." He angled the tablet carefully. Richard watched the grainy footage in silence. Snow smeared across the windshield, headlights bending off-white drifts. Then there she was, small as a sparrow against the side of the SUV, coat too thin for the weather, braids snapping in the wind. He watched her knock on the passenger window, disappear around the hood, struggle at the driver's side door, then lean in close enough for the interior light to catch her face for half a second. Young, black, determined in a way children were not supposed to need to be. Richard felt something tighten low in his chest that had nothing to do with the oxygen still clipped at his finger. He watched her remove her scarf, watched her wrap it around his neck with hands that looked painfully cold, watched her step back, hesitate, then turn and run into the storm because no one else had stopped. The room stayed still after the video ended. Even the heat vent seemed to hush itself. "How old is she?" Richard asked. Ethan shook his head. "We do not know yet." Richard looked at the scarf again. In one corner, stitched in pale thread that had nearly blended into the wool, were 2 letters. N and C. Not professional embroidery. The kind done by hand. Probably on a kitchen table. Probably by someone who could not afford to replace things easily. Richard stared at the initials until they blurred for a second. He blinked once and lifted his chin. "Find her." Ethan nodded. "I already started." That answer might have satisfied any other man fresh out of a night like Richard's, but not him. "Not now." "No," Richard said, voice rough but firmer. "Not the usual way. Do not hand it off to assistants and legal and public relations. Find her." Ethan understood immediately. This was not about optics. Not about a charitable press release. Not about a photo in a hospital room. Not about a check passed through 6 polite layers of distance. Something about the footage had cut straight through the polished insulation of Richard Holloway's life and reached the man underneath the money. Ethan placed the tablet aside. The gas station manager gave a statement. A woman named Denise Whitaker. She said the girl came in soaked through, asking her to call 911. Another employee, Earl Jenkins, drove back to the scene and later returned a pharmacy bag to her. Richard turned his head sharply despite the soreness in his neck. "Returned it. The girl had left medicine in your car. For her mother, apparently. She had spent her last money on it." Richard closed his eyes for one brief moment. In the darkness behind his lids, the story assembled itself with painful clarity. A child in a storm. A sick mother at home. A choice made in seconds. Help the stranger first. Then run. Did anyone get her name? He asked. Ethan hesitated. That was answer enough. Richard opened his eyes slowly. The private room around him suddenly felt too polished, too warm, too insulated from the kind of life that produced a child who would do something like that and vanish before thanks could reach her. Then we start with the initials, he said. And the gas station. And Mercer. And every apartment building within walking distance, if we have to. Ethan gave a small nod. There is one more thing. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and set a folded store receipt on the blanket. Wallace Pharmacy. Cough syrup. Crackers. Purchased with cash at 7:14 p.m. Richard looked from the receipt to the scarf, and then out toward the pale city skyline blurred behind the winter glass. Somewhere in that frozen expanse was a little girl who had seen a man alone in the cold and decided that was reason enough to stop. Richard pressed his hand over the scarf at his throat and said the words not like a billionaire issuing an order, but like a man trying to catch up to his own conscience. Bring me to her as soon as I can stand. By the second afternoon, the storm had passed, but the city still wore it everywhere. Snow sat in gray ridges along the curbs. Buses exhaled slush at every stop, and the sky above Chicago hung low and white like a sheet never fully shaken out. Naomi walked home from school with her backpack bouncing lightly against her coat, stepping over icy patches with the careful concentration of a child who had learned young that falling hurt more when nobody had time to fuss over it. School had felt strange all day. Not bad, just far away, as if part of her was still standing on Mercer Street beside that buried SUV, watching a pale man struggle to stay awake. She had not told anyone except her mother what happened. Not her teacher. Not the girl who shared markers with her in class. Not even Mrs. Alvarez in the front office, who always asked if Naomi wanted an extra carton of milk to take home. Some things felt too fragile once spoken aloud. Too easy for the world to turn into a story it did not understand. At the hospital across town, Ethan Brooks understood that the usual way of doing things would never be fast enough. By noon he had already spoken to Denise again, then Earl, then the tow dispatcher, then the overnight emergency supervisor who finally remembered seeing a note in the report about a child caller from Halstead Fuel. Each conversation gave him a piece, never the whole. Denise could describe Naomi's eyes, her soaked boots, the way she kept asking whether the man in the car would live. Earl could confirm the Wallace Pharmacy bag and the direction of the apartment building where he dropped the medicine. The tow dispatcher remembered the red scarf and the initials stitched into the corner. But nobody had a full name. Nobody had an address. Nobody, Ethan realized with a quiet frustration that sat like a stone in his chest, had thought to ask enough questions the first time, because the child who saved a life had been easy to overlook once the man in the custom wool coat was safely inside an ambulance. Richard Holloway sat upright in a chair by the window when Ethan returned to the hospital room, a blanket over his knees, one hand wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. The color had begun to return to his face, though weakness still shaped the way he moved. The scarf lay folded on the side table, careful as something sacred. Richard looked up the moment Ethan entered. Well, Ethan pulled the chair closer. She lives somewhere south of Mercer, likely within walking distance of Halstead Fuel. School age. African American. Her initials are NC. That is where we are. Richard absorbed that in silence. Beyond the glass, helicopters traced tiny lines over the skyline. That is not enough, he said. No, sir. Ethan hesitated, then added. But it is more than we had this morning. Richard set the tea down. Then we keep going. There was no impatience in his tone, just conviction, the kind sharpened by gratitude and something close to shame. Ethan had worked around enough powerful people to recognize the difference between a man performing concern and a man being changed by it. Richard was not interested in appearing noble. He was interested in reaching the child before the world taught her that goodness was usually thanked too late, if at all. That evening Naomi climbed the stairs to her building with her math worksheet sticking out of her folder and a carton of school milk in one hand. She could smell fried catfish from somewhere on the third floor and bleach from the hallway someone had mopped too heavily. Her mother was feeling better enough to be standing at the stove in old sweatpants, brow no longer fever bright. There was cornbread warming in the oven and a pot of red beans simmering low. The apartment felt fuller tonight, more awake. Naomi slipped off her coat and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, just watching her mother move. It made something in her unclench. Tasha glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "There's my girl." Naomi set the milk in the refrigerator and slid into her chair at the table. For a while they talked about ordinary things. A spelling quiz, a loose button on Naomi's uniform cardigan, whether the laundry downstairs would still be free if they caught the machine before Mrs. Talbert from 2B. It was the kind of talk that kept a life stitched together. But ordinary could only hold so long. Finally, Tasha turned down the stove and looked at her daughter. "You have been thinking about him all day, have you not?" Naomi traced the edge of her worksheet with one finger. "Maybe." Tasha gave her a mother's look, the one that saw straight through soft answers. Naomi sighed. "I just keep wondering if he remembers me." The question hung in the kitchen between the smell of beans and warm bread. Tasha came over, leaned against the counter, and folded her arms. "Why does that matter?" Naomi thought about it carefully before speaking. "Because if he does not, then maybe it was like I was not really there." Tasha's face changed then, not with anger, but with that quiet ache adults carry when children say something too true for their age. She crossed the kitchen and knelt beside Naomi's chair. "Listen to me," she said softly. "Whether he remembers you or not does not decide what happened. You were there. You helped. That matters even if nobody claps for it." Naomi nodded, but her eyes dropped to the table. It was not applause she wanted. Not really. It was something simpler. To know the man had lived. To know he had not opened his eyes in some bright room and thought the child in the storm had been a dream. Across the city, Ethan stood outside Wallace Pharmacy under a flickering sign while the store manager, a woman with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, scrolled through evening receipts from the storm night. Her finger paused. "Here," she said. "Cash purchase. Cough medicine, crackers. Paid by a woman named Tasha Carter. Sometimes her little girl picks up for her." Ethan felt the search narrow in one clean breath. "Do you have an address?" The woman looked at him over the rims of her glasses, measuring him. "Why?" Ethan took out a business card, then put it away again. Somehow that felt too polished for the truth. "Because her little girl saved my employer's life," he said, and for the first time all day, there was no corporate language in his voice at all. There was only gratitude. The woman stared at him a beat longer, then reached for the old account binder she kept beneath the register. Outside, snowmelt dripped steadily from the awning, ticking onto the sidewalk like a clock moving towards something that had already begun. The address was in Ethan's hand before 8 o'clock, written in blue ink on the back of a pharmacy invoice that smelled faintly like paper dust and hand lotion. South Wabash. 3rd floor walk up. Apartment 3C. He read it twice under the drugstore's buzzing fluorescent lights, then folded the paper with unusual care and slipped it into his coat pocket. Outside, the city had begun to thaw at the edges. Snow slid from awnings and wet sheets. Traffic hissed over black slush, and the air carried that heavy iron smell Chicago got when winter loosened its grip for just a few hours. Ethan sat behind the wheel of the town car without starting it right away. Through the windshield, he watched people move along the sidewalk in thick coats and knit caps, shoulders tucked against the cold, everybody carrying groceries or coffee or worry. Somewhere less than 3 miles away, in one of those aging brick buildings with rattling pipes and overworked radiators, was the child they had been searching for since dawn. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt careful. There was a difference between finding an address and arriving the right way. Upstairs in the hospital, Richard Holloway was standing when Ethan returned, one hand resting on the back of the chair near the window for balance. He had changed into a charcoal sweater and pressed slacks that one of his assistants had brought from home, but illness still lingered in the hollows beneath his eyes and in the slight stiffness of his movements. The scarf remained folded on the side table beside a legal pad covered in nothing. Richard had not worked all day, had not answered calls, had not opened the financial reports waiting in a leather folio by the sofa. Instead, he had spent the afternoon asking for small details. What kind of boots had the girl been wearing? How far the gas station was from Mercer? Whether the tow operator mentioned if she was shivering? Questions that would have sounded strange coming from anyone else. But from him, they sounded like a man trying to understand the exact shape of the mercy that had reached him. Ethan held up the folded paper. We have them. Richard did not ask who. He knew. Something in his face quieted at once, like a room after the right name had been spoken. Her mother is Tasha Carter, Ethan said. The girl lives with her in a 3-story brick building on South Wabash. 3rd floor. Apartment 3C. Richard let out a slow breath and glanced toward the scarf. Naomi Carter, he said. The initials had found their owner. The name hung in the room with a surprising warmth to it. Naomi. Small and steady. Richard nodded once, as if accepting a fact that already mattered to him. Then we go tonight. Ethan had expected that, but he still answered carefully. Your doctor wants another 24 hours. Richard looked over. The doctor also wanted me unconscious through half the morning. I declined that too. There was no arrogance in it. Only urgency. Ethan had learned long ago that Richard's voice grew quieter, not louder, when he meant something completely. I am not arriving with cameras, Richard continued. No gifts piled to the ceiling. No press. No photographers sent ahead. I am going to thank a child and her mother like a human being. Ethan hesitated. Understood. Richard picked up the scarf and ran his thumb over the crooked stitched letters. But I am not showing up empty-handed either. Across town, Naomi was at the kitchen table coloring the title page of a class report on winter animals, though the polar bear on the paper had remained half blue for almost 15 minutes because her mind kept wandering. Tasha, wrapped in a cardigan now instead of a robe, folded laundry from the coin machines downstairs while a local news station murmured softly from the television. The apartment had settled into evening sounds. The clink of hangers, water moving in the pipes, a child laughing somewhere in the hall, and then being hushed by an adult voice. Ordinary sounds, steady sounds. Naomi liked them. They told her the world was still in one piece. She pressed her crayon more firmly to the page and finally asked the question she had been carrying around all day like a pebble in her shoe. Mama, do rich people ever come back? Tasha paused with one of Naomi's socks in her hand. Come back from where? Naomi shrugged. Eyes still on the paper. After somebody helps them. Tasha considered that. The lamp beside the couch lit the side of her face in soft amber. Sometimes yes. Sometimes no. Naomi traced the polar bear's paw with careful concentration. What do you think this one will do? Tasha knew exactly who she meant. I think, she said slowly, pairing socks that did not perfectly match but were close enough, that if he remembers the right things, he will not forget you. Naomi nodded, though she was not sure that answered the ache under her ribs. She had imagined many versions of what might happen next. Maybe nothing. Maybe a letter. Maybe a stranger knocking one day to return the scarf. But none of the versions felt entirely real, because children who lived in apartments like hers were usually expected to remain in the background of other people's big moments. They were not the kind of people stories came back for. At the hospital garage an hour later, Richard lowered himself carefully into the back seat of the car, breath controlled, jaw set against the lingering weakness in his body. He had refused the wheelchair and compromised only enough to let Ethan open the door for him. On the seat beside him rested a long, cream-colored envelope and a simple gift bag from the hospital gift shop. Nothing extravagant, only a plush gray blanket, a box of herbal tea, and a children's book about winter stars that Richard had chosen after standing too long in front of the display, unsure what a 9-year-old girl might actually like. It was the uncertainty that humbled him most. He knew how to buy art, companies, buildings, silence. But he did not know the first proper thing to carry to the home of a child who had saved his life. The car pulled out into the evening. Streetlights glowed in thawing puddles. Downtown glass gave way to older blocks, narrower streets, laundromats and beauty supply stores and churches with glowing red signs promising prayer on Wednesdays. Richard watched it all through the window with an attentiveness he had not offered the city in years. He had lived above it for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to move through it at eye level. When they turned onto South Wabash, he saw the building at once. Brick weathered dark with age. Iron railing chipped at the stairs. 3 floors of windows, some lit warm yellow, some still dark. A little girl's bicycle leaned against the side wall with one handle wrapped in silver tape. Richard's hand tightened around Naomi's scarf. At that exact moment upstairs, Naomi had just placed her blue crayon down when a low, unfamiliar sound rolled into the street below, smooth and deep, like distant thunder made of engines. Tasha looked up first. Naomi followed her gaze to the window. Then both of them stood at the same time. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Naomi stood on a wooden chair pulled up to the window, one hand pressed to the cold glass, and counted the cars again because the number felt too unreal to trust the first time. One at the curb, 3 behind it. Then more stretching down the block, sleek and black and polished clean despite the slush. Their headlights washed the old brick buildings in pale gold. Chrome glinted under the street lamp. Doors stayed shut for one suspended second that made the moment feel even bigger, as if the city itself had paused to see what would happen next. Down below, neighbors had already begun to gather in doorways and behind curtains. Mrs. Talbert from 2B stood on the landing in her house shoes and robe, one hand over her chest. 2 boys from across the street had stopped tossing a half-flat basketball and were staring openly. Somewhere a window lifted with the scrape of painted wood. Naomi's heart thudded so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Mama," she whispered, not taking her eyes off the line of cars. "They really came here." Tasha stepped beside her, cardigan wrapped tight around herself, and rested one hand lightly on Naomi's back. She looked tired still, but no longer fragile. There was strength in the straightness of her shoulders now, the kind that returns slowly after sickness and all at once after fear. "Looks like they did," she said. Down on the sidewalk, the first rear door opened. Richard Holloway stepped out carefully, one gloved hand braced against the edge of the car for balance. He was taller than Naomi remembered. Maybe because the first time she had seen him, he had been folded into the driver's seat under dashboard light and snow. Now he stood in a charcoal overcoat with a scarf at his throat that was not hers, though Naomi recognized the slowness in his movement, the careful way he drew breath. Ethan came around the front of the car immediately, close. Enough to help if needed, but wise enough not to crowd him. Richard said something quiet to him, then looked up. Not at the building in general. At the third-floor window. At the exact pane where a little girl in an oversized sweatshirt stood frozen with wide eyes and one blue crayon still clutched in her hand. Naomi took a startled step back from the glass. "He remembers," she breathed. Tasha heard the wonder in it and reached for her daughter's hand. "Go put on your shoes," she said. Naomi blinked. "Right now?" "Right now." The apartment shifted into motion. Naomi dropped from the chair and ran for the door, then doubled back for her sneakers, then forgot why she had doubled back and grabbed the edge of the table for a second just to steady all the feelings rushing through her at once. Tasha moved faster than Naomi had seen her move in days, smoothing her hair with one hand, straightening the collar of her own cardigan with the other, glancing around the room as if she could somehow make their life look less small in 30 seconds. But there was no time to hide the chipped mug on the sink or the patched cushion on the couch or the stack of folded laundry waiting on the armchair. The apartment was what it was. Warm, clean, humble, honest. The buzzer sounded downstairs, sharp and sudden. Naomi jumped. Tasha squeezed her shoulder. "Breathe, baby." Naomi nodded and tried. Through the thin apartment door, footsteps echoed in the stairwell. Slow, measured, more than one set, but not a crowd. Tasha looked through the peephole first. Her posture changed at once, not with fear, but with the awareness that life had just carried something enormous to her threshold. She opened the door. Richard Holloway stood in the hallway under the dim yellow light, his overcoat dusted with a few half-melted snowflakes, his face paler than it should have been but alive, unmistakably alive. Ethan stood one step behind him holding a simple gift bag and a cream-colored envelope. No photographers. No assistants with clipboards. No spectacle beyond the cars outside and the silence that had fallen over the whole floor. For a heartbeat nobody spoke. Naomi peered from behind her mother's arm, and Richard's gaze found her instantly. The change in his face was quiet but total, like a man suddenly locating. The exact place his life had split into before and after. "Naomi Carter," he said softly, as if he had been carrying the name for hours and was relieved to finally return it to its owner. Naomi's fingers tightened around Tasha's sleeve. "Yes, sir." Richard looked at her the way people look at something both precious and difficult to deserve. "I was hoping it was you." Tasha, still holding the door, kept one arm half around Naomi without thinking. Her voice, when it came, was polite but steady, the voice of a mother who had learned not to be dazzled faster than she could protect. "Mr. Holloway, I assume." Richard inclined his head. "Yes, ma'am." There was an old-fashioned courtesy in the answer that made Tasha notice him more carefully. Not just the coat or the cuff links or the exhaustion around his eyes. The humility, or maybe the effort toward it. "I know this is unexpected," he said, "and I should have called first if I had any way to do that. But your daughter saved my life 3 nights ago, and thank you did not seem like something I wanted handled over the phone." The hallway went very still. Naomi's eyes flicked from his face to Ethan's and back again, as if she was still trying to understand how the storm had followed her all the way into this narrow third-floor corridor with peeling paint and a flickering light bulb. Tasha looked down at Naomi, then back at Richard. Something gentled in her expression, though caution remained. "Would you like to come in?" Richard hesitated just long enough to suggest he knew what it meant to cross into somebody else's hard-kept space. "Only if you are sure." "I am sure," Tasha said. She stepped aside. Richard entered slowly, taking in the apartment with one sweep of his eyes that did not feel judging at all, only attentive. The radiator hissed. The pot on the stove still held the warmth of beans from dinner. On the table lay Naomi's unfinished report on winter animals, one blue crayon, beside a drawing of a half-colored polar bear. Richard noticed that too. He noticed everything. Then he turned fully toward Naomi, reached into his coat pocket, and drew out a folded length of red wool. Her scarf. He held it in both hands, careful as if it belonged in a museum instead of a child's coat closet. "I believe," he said, his voice low with feeling he was no longer trying to hide. "This belongs to you." Naomi stared at the scarf as if it had crossed an ocean instead of a few miles of frozen city. Up close it looked smaller than she remembered, the red wool still slightly stretched where she had yanked it off in a hurry, the pale stitched letters at the corner a little crooked because Tasha had sewn them by hand while sitting at this very kitchen table last winter. For a second Naomi did not move. Then she stepped forward and took it with both hands, almost reverently, as if the act of getting it back made the whole night real in a new way. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt too small for everything hanging in the room. Richard shook his head faintly. "No," he said, his voice roughened by honesty more than illness. "Thank you." The apartment went still again. Not awkward, just full of meaning pressing against the walls, against the radiator hiss, against the amber lamp glow falling over the couch and the half-finished schoolwork on the table. Tasha motioned toward the small sitting area. "Please," she said, "sit down before you fall down in my kitchen." A faint smile touched Ethan's mouth at that. Richard seemed almost surprised by it himself, but he obeyed at once, lowering carefully onto the couch with the caution of a man whose body had not entirely forgiven him yet. Ethan remained standing near the doorway until Tasha pointed to the armchair with the kind of practical authority that did not leave much room for refusal. He sat too. Naomi stayed where she was, scarf held against her chest, eyes on Richard, as if she were still making sure he was truly the same man from the car. The difference between then and now was almost hard to hold in one mind. On Mercer Street he had been pale and fading into the cold, his breath thin, his words barely there. Here he looked expensive in a way Naomi could not have described exactly, from the cut of his coat to the shine of his shoes, but also strangely fragile, like the snowstorm had taken something invisible from him and not yet decided whether to give it back. Richard looked around the apartment once more, not with discomfort, but with attention. The folded laundry, the clean dishes drying on a towel, the school backpack by the wall with one zipper missing its pull. He seemed to understand what kind of care lived here. "Miss Carter," he said, turning to Tasha, "I know there is no graceful way to arrive at someone's door like this with half a motorcade outside, and for that I apologize." Tasha folded her arms, but there was no hostility in it, only steadiness. "It is certainly a new one for this building," she said. Richard glanced down for a moment, then back up. "I asked them to keep it simple." From the hallway outside came the muffled sound of someone whispering and another neighbor being shushed. Even Naomi almost smiled at that. Tasha did, just barely. "Well," she said, "your version of simple and ours may not be identical." That earned a quiet breath of laughter from Ethan, quickly hidden behind one hand. The tension in the room loosened by a fraction. Richard looked at Naomi then, fully, and whatever faint smile had touched the room disappeared beneath something more serious. "I watched the footage from the vehicle camera," he said. Naomi blinked. "There was a camera?" "There was," Ethan said gently. That is how we found out what you did. Naomi looked down at the scarf in her hands. I did not do much. Richard leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes steady on hers. You did more than anyone else did. The words landed softly, but they landed. Naomi shifted her weight. Children knew the sound of truth when adults stopped decorating it. I just saw you there, she said. And you looked cold. Richard's expression changed with that, the way expressions do when simple kindness reveals the poverty of everything complicated around it. He had spent most of his life in rooms where people chose words for effect, where favors were counted, where concern often arrived attached to advantage. But this child had reduced the whole event to its moral center with one sentence. You looked cold. That was all. That was enough. Tasha walked to the stove and reached automatically for the kettle. Tea, she asked, because some instincts survived every class divide. Richard nodded. Thank you. Ethan started to decline, but Tasha gave him a look that ended the discussion before it began. Naomi moved closer to the couch now, slow and curious. Do you feel better? She asked. Richard looked at her, as if the question itself had reached someplace in him no board meeting ever had. Here he was in a third-floor apartment, with wealth lined up outside by the curb and gratitude filling his throat, and the first thing the child who saved him wanted to know was not whether he was important, not whether he had money, not whether the cars were really his. It was whether he felt better. I do, he said softly. Because of you. Naomi absorbed that with solemn seriousness. Then she asked, Did your fever go away? Ethan looked down at his hands. Tasha went very still with the kettle in hers. Richard closed his eyes for one brief second, just enough to gather himself against the ache of being seen with such innocence. When he opened them again, they were brighter than before. Yes, he said. It did. Naomi nodded once, satisfied in a way that made the whole room feel humbler. Tasha set 4 mugs on the table, none of them matching. Steam rose in thin white ribbons. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out the cream-colored envelope. He held it for a second, then placed it on the table without flourish. There are practical things I would like to do for your family, he said carefully. Tasha's eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to his face. Her shoulders straightened almost invisibly. Richard saw it and continued before misunderstanding could harden. Not because I think generosity can purchase what your daughter did. It cannot. And not because I assume you need saving. You do not strike me as people waiting for that. Tasha's gaze stayed level. Richard went on. I am here because Naomi showed me a kind of decency that I should have recognized in this city long before I needed it personally. I would like to help with your medical bills, with Naomi's schooling, with whatever immediate needs the storm and this winter may have made heavier. But I would like to do it in whatever way respects your dignity. The kitchen seemed smaller for a moment, not from discomfort, but because truth spoken plainly had a way of making walls irrelevant. Tasha said nothing right away. Naomi looked from one adult to the other, sensing the gravity, even if not every detail belonged to her yet. Then Richard placed the small gift bag beside the envelope and managed the faintest smile. And that, he said, is simply because I did not want to arrive empty-handed to thank a girl who handed me her scarf in a snowstorm. Tasha did not reach for the envelope. That, more than anything, told Richard Holloway who she was. Some people lunged toward opportunity out of fear it might vanish. Others rejected it too quickly out of pride. But Tasha Carter sat down across from him at her own small kitchen table, folded her hands once, and looked at him with the careful steadiness of a woman who had learned that survival required equal parts gratitude and caution. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. Steam lifted from the mismatched mugs, carrying the scent of peppermint tea through the apartment. Naomi had opened the gift bag by then, not greedily, just with the quiet concentration she seemed to bring to everything. Inside she found the soft gray blanket and the book about winter stars. Her fingers lingered on the cover, tracing the silver constellations with wonder she did not yet know how to hide. This is for me, she asked. Richard nodded. It is. Naomi looked up at him. Thank you. Then, as naturally as if the question belonged beside it, she asked, Do you like books too? Richard almost smiled. I used to more than I have lately. Naomi absorbed that answer the way children do, without judgment, as if adults were allowed to drift away from good things and perhaps find their way back. Tasha noticed the exchange, and some of the guardedness in her face softened. Naomi reads everything she can get her hands on, she said. Library books, cereal boxes, old mailers if I leave them on the table long enough. Naomi gave her mother a look of mild protest, but Richard's expression warmed. That sounds like someone worth investing in, he said. The word slipped out before he could replace it with something gentler. Tasha heard it. So did he. For half a beat the room tightened around the language of boardrooms and portfolios, around the old instinct of a man who had spent decades measuring value in terms that fit on paper. Richard leaned back slightly, regret flickering across his face. That was not the right word, he said. I meant she deserves every chance this world can offer. Tasha held his gaze a moment longer, then gave a small nod. That is a better sentence. Ethan, quiet until then, glanced down at his tea to hide the ghost of a smile. Naomi had already opened the book to a page showing Orion over a snowfield, unaware she had just witnessed two adults negotiate the moral terms of generosity in a room no larger than some people's closets. Richard watched her turn the pages and felt again that sharp, humbling awareness of how little he understood about the practical texture of her life. The school report on winter animals. The carefully repaired backpack zipper. The apartment kept so clean it seemed to shine from effort more than materials. Nothing here asked for pity. Everything here testified to discipline. Ms. Carter, he said at last, if you would prefer time to think, I can leave the envelope and go. Tasha looked toward Naomi, then back at him. What exactly is in it? She asked. Richard answered plainly. A cashier's check to cover your recent medical expenses and any immediate needs. Information for a trust my attorney can establish in Naomi's name for her education. And my direct number, not an office line. In case you decide later that you want none of it, some of it, or something structured differently. Tasha's eyebrows rose a fraction at that last part. You brought a refusal option. Richard folded his hands. Respectfully, yes. Something in her face changed again. Not surrender. Recognition. The kind one adult feels when another finally understands that help offered badly can wound as much as neglect. I appreciate that, she said quietly. Naomi looked up from the book then, sensing the seriousness even if not all its particulars. Mama, what is a trust? Tasha exhaled softly through her nose. Richard answered before she had to. It means money set aside for your future, Naomi. For school. For whatever kind of life you want to build when you are older. Naomi considered that with solemn care, then glanced at her mother. Does it mean you do not have to worry so much? The question landed like a hand laid gently on a bruise no one had mentioned. Tasha looked down for 1 second, then back up, eyes brighter than before. Richard did not move. Ethan did not either. The whole apartment seemed to lean toward the answer. Maybe a little less, Tasha said finally. Naomi nodded, satisfied not by the money itself, but by the possibility of easing something she had noticed in her mother long before she could name it. Richard looked at the child and felt the truth of the moment settle deep in him. In his world, people often asked what they could gain. Naomi asked what burden might lighten for someone she loved. That difference was larger than wealth, larger than class. It was the difference between transaction and grace. Tasha reached for the envelope at last, not hurriedly, not like a gift dropped from the sky, but like a document she intended to read line by line. I will look through this, she said, and I will not promise more than that tonight. Richard inclined his head. That is fair. But, Tasha added, her voice gentler now, I do believe you came here for the right reasons. Richard let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Across the room, Naomi wrapped the gray blanket around her shoulders and looked suddenly even smaller, a child again, cocooned in softness after days of carrying something too large. Richard watched her and thought of the footage from the storm, the red scarf at her throat, the half-mile run through snow while other people kept walking. He had come here thinking gratitude was the purpose of the night. But sitting in this warm apartment with peppermint steam curling into the light, and a little girl asking only whether her mother might worry less, he realized gratitude was only the beginning. Something else was taking shape beneath it, quieter and more demanding. A responsibility not just to thank the child who saved him, but to deserve, in whatever way a grown man still could, the decency she had shown without hesitation. And when Naomi looked up from her book and met his eyes again, Richard saw that she was no longer studying him like a stranger from a storm. She was simply making sure he meant what he said. After that, the room changed in a way no one announced. Nothing dramatic happened. No music swelled. No speeches arrived polished and perfect. But something inside the little apartment settled into place, as if all the pieces had finally recognized each other. Tasha opened the envelope and read every page slowly, the paper making a soft, careful sound in the warm kitchen light. Richard did not interrupt. Ethan did not check his phone. Naomi sat cross-legged on the couch with the Winter Stars book open in her lap, the gray blanket wrapped around her shoulders, though every few moments her eyes drifted back to the adults as if she could feel the future moving quietly across the room. Outside, engines still purred at the curb, low and expensive, but in here the loudest things were the radiator tapping and the kettle cooling and the tiny turn of pages as Tasha read. At last, she set the papers down and looked at Richard for a long moment. "This is real," she said. Richard nodded once. "It is." Tasha glanced at Naomi, then back at him. "Then I will say this plainly. I do not want my daughter turned into a story people use to make themselves feel generous for 5 minutes. I do not want cameras in her school. I do not want interviews. I do not want strangers deciding who she is because she did one brave thing on one hard night." Richard listened without flinching. "Neither do I," he said. "There will be no press release. No media. No charity gala with her name on a screen. What she did belongs first to her, and to you." Tasha searched his face for any sign of performance and found none. That mattered. More than the envelope. More than the cars. More than the numbers on the page, she was still trying to believe. "Then yes," she said quietly. "I will accept the help." Naomi looked up. The words themselves meant less to her than the way her mother's shoulders finally dropped half an inch, but she felt the importance all the same. Richard did not smile in triumph. He only lowered his head once, a gesture almost like relief, almost like gratitude answered by trust. "Thank you," he said. Tasha gave a small, tired laugh at that. "You are the only rich man I have ever heard say thank you after handing somebody life-changing paperwork." Richard's expression softened. "It is your dignity I am thanking, not your permission." Ethan looked out the window then, giving the moment its privacy, though he felt it too. For years he had watched powerful people enter rooms expecting deference before they earned decency. Tonight, he was watching decency lead and power learn how to follow. Naomi slid off the couch and padded over in her socks, the gray blanket trailing behind her like a little cloud. She stood beside her mother's chair and leaned against her arm, eyes on the papers. "Does this mean Mama can go to the doctor without waiting?" she asked. Tasha's mouth parted, but no sound came first. Richard answered gently. "Yes, it means that." Naomi thought about it, then asked another question in that same quiet, direct way that seemed to cut through every adult layer and reach the center. "Does it mean if the heat breaks, we do not have to pretend it is fine?" Tasha let out a breath that trembled at the edges. Richard looked around the apartment again, this time seeing not just the care, but the cost of having to make courage look ordinary day after day. "Yes," he said. "It means that too." Naomi nodded once and tucked the blanket closer around her shoulders. That was enough for her. Not luxury, not wonder, relief. The kind children recognize faster than adults admit. Richard rose slowly from the couch then, one hand pressing briefly to his side, not from pain exactly, but from the lingering weakness that reminded him how close he had come to never seeing this room at all. Naomi noticed and frowned. "You should still sit down some more," she said. Ethan almost laughed, but Richard only looked at her with that same quiet astonishment he had worn all evening. "You may be right," he said. Naomi pointed to the couch with all the seriousness of a tiny nurse. "Mama says if you rush healing, your body gets irritated." Tasha closed her eyes for 1 second, smiling despite herself. "I do say that." Richard sat back down obediently, and for a moment the room warmed with an ease none of them had expected at the beginning of the night. They spoke then of smaller things. Naomi's school, her favorite subject, which changed depending on whether she had library day. Tasha's work before she got sick. The building manager who still had not fixed the hallway light on the second floor. Richard told Naomi that when he was a boy, he used to look at the stars through a telescope from the roof of his grandfather's garage. Naomi opened the book to Orion again and listened as if the memory itself were something bright being handed to her. Time softened around them. The gap between penthouse life and third-floor walk-up did not disappear, but it stopped being the most important thing in the room. When at last Richard stood for the second time, The departure felt quieter, heavier in a different way. He placed his card on the table beside the envelope. "You may call for any reason," he said to Tasha. Then he looked at Naomi. "And that includes book recommendations." Naomi smiled then, small but real, the first unguarded smile he had seen from her. "I know a lot of good ones," she said. Richard believed her. At the door, he paused and turned back once more. Taking in the little apartment lit gold against the winter dark, the child with the red scarf now looped over the back of the chair, the mother standing straighter than when he arrived. The life he had walked into as a stranger and would not walk away from unchanged. "There is one more thing," he said. Tasha and Naomi both looked up. Richard's voice lowered, not with drama, but with decision. "What Naomi did for me should not be rare in this city. No one should be left stranded in a storm because help lives on the wrong side of town. I am starting something next week. Heated shuttle routes, emergency winter transport, support teams in the neighborhoods hardest hit when the weather turns dangerous. I am calling it Winter Safe Ride." Ethan glanced at him, surprised only because the plan had formed so recently and already sounded inevitable. Richard kept his eyes on Naomi. "Your daughter reminded me what responsibility actually looks like. I intend to remember." The words did not land like a promise made for applause. They landed like a man rewriting his own measure of worth. Tasha looked at him and knew, with the deep instinct women like her develop after years of reading what men mean beneath what they say, that he was telling the truth. Naomi hugged the Stars book to her chest. "So other people will not be alone?" she asked. Richard nodded. "So other people will not be alone." Naomi seemed to think that was exactly right. Outside, one by one, the cars began to pull away from the curb, their headlights sweeping softly across the old brick and thawing snow. Upstairs, the apartment felt strangely still after the door closed, as if the air itself were adjusting to what had just happened. Tasha stood by the table with the envelope under one hand and tears she had held back all evening finally shining in her eyes. Naomi walked to the window and watched the last black SUV glide into the street, its red taillights blurring in the wet winter dark. She rested one small hand against the glass and did not wave. She only watched until the final glow disappeared, then touched the red scarf draped over the chair and whispered into the warm quiet of the room. He remembered. The next week, winter softened without ever fully leaving. Dirty snow still clung to the edges of parking lots and crouched in the shadows of alleys. But the sidewalks had begun to show through, and the city no longer sounded buried. It sounded awake again. Buses groaned. Crosswalk signals chirped. Somewhere below Naomi's classroom window, a delivery truck backed up with a long mechanical beep that made 3 kids glance outside at once. Naomi Carter sat at her desk with a sharpened pencil in one hand and a library book tucked beneath her math sheet, trying very hard to focus on fractions while the world kept tugging at her attention from every direction. It had been 6 days since Richard Holloway came to apartment 3C. 6 days since the row of black cars lined the street like something out of another universe. 6 days since her mother had cried in the kitchen after the door closed, and then laughed a little through the tears because relief and disbelief sometimes were the same face. Life had not turned into a fairy tale after that. The radiator still clanked. The upstairs neighbor still dragged furniture at odd hours. Mrs. Talbot still knocked to borrow sugar and stayed to ask questions she pretended were not questions. But things had shifted. Tasha had gone to the doctor without spending the bus ride there figuring out what bill might have to wait. The pharmacy bag on the counter held medicine, not ration spoon, by careful spoon out of fear. The building manager, suddenly much more responsive after a certain polite call from a certain office, had fixed the second-floor hallway light and promised to look at the heat in 2 other units by the weekend. Small changes, maybe, if measured from far away. But from inside the life that held them, they felt enormous. That Friday afternoon, Naomi and Tasha stood on the corner outside the public library, bundled in coats, watching a white shuttle bus pull up to the curb. Not flashy, not luxurious, just clean, warm, and clearly marked with blue letters along the side. Winter Safe Ride. The doors folded open with a hydraulic sigh, and a driver in a navy jacket leaned out with a smile. "First day," he said proudly. "You ladies heading north?" Tasha glanced down at Naomi, then back at the bus, and for a second emotion moved across her face so openly that she did not try to hide it. Naomi stepped up first, her backpack bumping lightly against the rail. Warm air wrapped around her cheeks at once. Inside, the bus smelled like fresh upholstery, coffee from someone's travel mug, and that particular clean scent public vehicles get on the first day before the city has fully had its say. Seats filled steadily. An elderly man with a cane. A nurse in scrubs under her coat. A woman with 2 grocery bags and a toddler asleep against her shoulder. A teenager carrying a trumpet case. Ordinary people. Tired people. People who would otherwise be standing too long in cold wind or paying too much for rides they could barely afford. Naomi slid into a window seat and watched her mother sit beside her, one gloved hand still resting for a moment on the blue vinyl, as if testing whether kindness this practical could really be solid. He did it, Naomi whispered. Tasha looked out at the letters on the side of the bus and nodded slowly. Yes, she said. He did. Across town, on the top floor of a glass building where the windows looked over the river and the city spread out in silver and steel, Richard Holloway stood without speaking at the end of a conference room table while a presentation clicked forward on the wall behind him. Routes, fuel costs, emergency call partnerships, neighborhood maps marked in red, blue, and yellow. His executive team sat unusually quiet, not because the plan was impossible, but because it had arrived from a part of him some of them had never seen before. He was still a powerful man, still precise, still capable of ending an argument with one level sentence. But there was something else in him now, something less impressed by polish and more interested in consequence. We are not treating this as seasonal public relations, he said, his voice calm enough to make everyone listen harder. This is infrastructure. If a child can understand that no one should be left alone in dangerous weather, then adults with resources have no excuse for pretending the problem is complicated. No one spoke after that. There was nothing clever to add. That evening, after dinner, Naomi sat by the apartment window with the Winter Stars book open on her knees and her red scarf folded beside her. Outside, the street lamps turned the thawing slush to ribbons of gold. Inside, the apartment glowed warm. Tasha was humming softly while folding towels, healthier now, stronger in the small movements that make up a home. On the table near the lamp sat a framed photo Ethan had sent over that morning, printed and simple, taken during the bus launch. One white shuttle at the curb, its doors open, people boarding with their heads up instead of bowed against the cold. Naomi liked that picture. She liked that it was not about rich people at all. A soft knock came at the door. Not urgent. Not grand. Just 2 measured taps. Tasha opened it to find Ethan standing there alone, coat collar turned up against the wind, a slim envelope in his hand. I was nearby, he said, though all 3 of them knew nearby meant he had come on purpose. Mr. Holloway asked me to drop this off. Tasha let him in. Naomi set down her book. Ethan handed her the envelope directly. He said this one was for you. Naomi opened it carefully. Inside was a card. Thick cream paper, Richard's handwriting surprisingly neat and old-fashioned across the center. It read, Naomi, I spent many years believing power meant being protected from discomfort. You reminded me it should mean protecting others from being left alone in it. I hope you keep reading, keep asking honest questions, and keep that brave heart exactly as it is. Thank you for saving my life, but even more than that, thank you for changing how I intend to live it. Richard. Naomi read it. Twice. Then a third time, slower. She did not say anything right away. She just held the card in both hands and looked down at the ink as if she understood, in the way children sometimes do, that words written carefully can become a place to stand. Tasha turned toward the window for a moment, blinking at the streetlights. Ethan cleared his throat softly and pretended not to notice. Naomi finally looked up. Can you tell him something for me? Ethan smiled. I can. Naomi thought about it. Card still in her hand, red scarf beside her, the room warm with folded towels and lamplight, and all the ordinary things that now felt newly precious. Tell him, she said. I am glad he is not cold anymore. Ethan's smile changed then, gentled by something he could not quite hide. I will. After he left, the apartment became quiet again, but not the empty kind. It was the good kind. The kind that settles after truth has been spoken and believed. Naomi returned to the window and pressed her fingers lightly to the glass. Down below, the city moved on as it always did, headlights passing, doors opening and closing, people carrying bags and burdens and hopes through the evening. But some part of it had shifted. Not the skyline, not the wealth, not the weather. Something smaller and more important than that. A direction, a memory, a man who had almost disappeared into a snowstorm, and a little girl who refused to let him. Naomi touched the edge of the scarf, then looked out at the lights as if reading a story written across the dark. She was only 9. She was not rich. She was not powerful. But in the coldest night of one man's life, she had reminded him what warmth was for. And in the end, she did not change the whole world. She changed one heart, then a city block, then a winter route. And maybe that was how the world changed anyway, not all at once, but quietly, whenever someone small chose not to walk away.